So there's a new Exorcist film in theaters and I just checked it out. What did I think about it? Well, stick around to find out. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be talking about The Exorcist Believer. Directed by David Gordon Green, who wrote this film alongside Danny McBride, Scott Teems, and Peter Sattler. This film stars people like Olivia O'Neill, Lydia Jewett, Leslie Odom Jr., Jennifer Nettles, Ellen Burstyn, and many more. So here we are now with the latest installment into the Exorcist franchise. It's been quite some time since we've gotten an official Exorcist film. We've gotten plenty of exorcism films and paranormal films, but it's been a while since we've had a new installment into this series. And as I started to see a lot of the marketing coming out, most notably the trailer, I was getting excited for this as it utilizes, of course, the music from the original film, which has always been one of my favorite horror themes of all time. And most notably in the trailer, connects to the original film by bringing back the character of Chris McNeil, played by Ellen Burstyn, which was pretty cool to see instantly in the marketing. I was excited to see what they would do with her character, and yeah, I went into this movie pretty excited, but also a little bit wary because going into it, I saw a bit of a split when it came down to the reactions I was seeing, as of course there were some early press screenings that already happened and some early fan screenings that again had some split reactions. Some of my peers who got to check out the film before I did were giving it something around the range of 4 stars to 5 stars on Letterboxd, with others giving it somewhere around the range of 1.5 stars to 2.5 stars. So clearly there was a massive divide. So I tried to go in with no expectations whatsoever. I didn't really know fully what to expect. However, I was a little wary going into the film, knowing that David Gordon Green was the director and that he wrote the film alongside other writers who helped him write the latest Halloween trilogy. And while I enjoyed the first of that new Halloween trilogy, where Laurie Strode is a badass, I was not a huge fan of Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends. I enjoyed bits of both of those films, and there's plenty of great filmmaking done in both of those films, but when it came down to the writing and the story overall of those films, I found myself very much disconnected, and I was not a huge fan. They didn't really sit well with me as time has gone on. So going into this film, I was a little wary that that same team was going to take another classic horror franchise and possibly do something I was not going to be a fan of. So with that said, let's talk about what this movie is all about. You have 2 teenage girls who end up going missing after they strolled off into the woods after a day of school to go and do something very specific. 3 days later, they pop up with no memory of what's gone on, and they seem a little bit strange. And of course, as you can tell with it being an Exorcist film, it turns out that they are possessed. Now their families must work together to try to find what they can do to save their daughters from the demon who has possessed them. And of course, there's an exorcism by the time we get to the end of the film. And going into it, like I mentioned before, I was really excited, mainly because it was connecting more so to the original film. You have Chris McNeil coming back as a character. And what I'll say on that front right out of the gate is I do think that they kind of wasted Ellen Burstyn. I think that they could have done so much more with her. I think that some of the best stuff and the things that you want to see with her are in the trailer. And while there's a little bit more than there is in the trailer, she's not in the film for a whole lot of it. And quite frankly, I was not very much a fan of what they choose to do with her character and how they handle her. There is some nice fan service in the film by the time you get to the end of it that I undeniably kind of had a smile on my face for, but there was an element as well of it kind of feeling like forced fan service that didn't ultimately, in my eyes, honor the original characters, in my opinion, that they decided to kind of, sprinkle in here. Beyond that, though, when it comes down to this movie, what I found interesting is the film hones in on the character of Victor, played by Leslie Odom Jr., who is the father of one of the girls. He's a single father. His wife passed away in childbirth, and so he's somebody who's kind of struggled with religion and faith throughout his life. His wife was definitely somebody who leaned more into that, and now he finds himself in a situation where his daughter is literally possessed, and the other girl who's possessed in the situation, her family is just the typical white Christian family that goes to church every Sunday, and now they kind of have these different clashing beliefs, and they kind of have to find a way to work together to save their daughters. And of course, it all leads to an exorcism at the end of the film. I think this is a film that's going to divide people, as on our drive home just now, I was actually saying, I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. I didn't dislike it, but I enjoyed myself. I thought it was a good time. I thought this was a solid installment in the Exorcist franchise. I think when you look at some of the sequels that came out after the original Exorcist, there are some piss poor follow-ups to that original film, and I think that this is definitely one of the better sequels that we've gotten in the Exorcist franchise since the original. Now, the original is an all-time classic that completely changed the game for its time and revolutionized horror, and since then, there's been so many copycats, so many exorcism films, so many possession films, to the point where now there's just so many cliches and tropes, and things that were not really cliches or tropes when The Exorcist came out. And so with that said, there is this element with this film that does lean into some of those cliches, some of those tropes, most notably things like just kind of random jump scares that are loud in a quick moment to try to get you to jump. And a couple of them got me, but a lot of times it was just because of this loud burst of noise and not so much because the movie was scary. Now, I think where this film really shined for me is in its production value, as I found that the makeup design, the costume design, the overall look, feel, and vibe of the film was creepy and eerie. I don't necessarily know that I'm going to lose sleep tonight. I don't think this was necessarily as scary in any way, shape, or form as the original Exorcist or as other horror films in general that are really impactful. But I found myself creeped out at times. I found a lot of the scenes to be eerie. And the most notable thing for me are the two young girls who are possessed in this film, who are played by Olivia and Lidya Jewett. I thought that their performances were great, oftentimes being the thing that creeped me out the most. Unfortunately, like I was mentioning before, with kind of the way that they bring in Ellen Burstyn into this story, there are elements of this movie that do feel just kind of like the trailer showed way too much. You know, there was this element of feeling like some of the best lines and the creepiest moments of dialogue were shown in the trailer. And while there's a little bit more that you obviously haven't seen because the movie is much longer than the trailer, I feel like the movie doesn't spend enough time with the possession side of things. The exorcism portion of the film should have been a lot longer, could have and should have been. And there's a lot of the film that is all of these characters kind of trying to figure out what they can do to lead up to the possession. And alongside that, there's a group of characters that are all involved outside of the families themselves that oftentimes didn't feel like they really needed to be there. There were a couple of characters that felt like they were undercooked and just kind of random in the movie, and oftentimes kind of took away from where I feel like they could have honed in a little bit more on the other characters that actually mattered. But what I found interesting about this film is, as I mentioned, you have the Christian family who's dealing with this from one perspective, and you have this father who just wants to get his daughter back, who we're really focusing on, played by Leslie Odom Jr. And for me, that's where this film really shined, is this father having to believe more than anything in his daughter, believe more than anything in their love and the connection that they've built over the years, more so than in the religion side of things and in the faith side of things, to try to reach out to his daughter to save her. There are some things that I would have to lean into spoilers for here to say that I didn't like, but ultimately there just for me felt like there was some things that felt undercooked, some things that felt over kind of breezed by. There was definitely some things that felt like we're a little bit dragging here and dragging there, but ultimately, besides some of those gripes, I did like the film. I found it to be an enjoyable time. I thought it was a solid horror film that had some cool creepy factors to it. I enjoyed the visuals of the film, and when I think about some of the, again, piss poor sequels that we got to the Exorcist franchise, or the original Exorcist in particular, I think that this is definitely one of the better ones. I sit in the middle of some of the criticisms I've seen from people. I don't necessarily think this is, you know, top tier Exorcist, but by no means do I think this is a completely just misfire or a bad film. And when it comes down to what David Gordon Green has done in terms of horror franchises recently, I'd argue that I enjoyed this more so than some of the Halloween films that he's done recently, which may not be a high bar to cross, but I'm just happy that it was crossed. Quite frankly, for me, I think that The Exorcist Believer is a good time. I think if you're a fan of The Exorcist and if you're a fan of horror films in general, it's definitely worth watching. Now, whether or not this is worth running to theaters to see for you is really going to be dependent upon if the trailers are gripping to you or not. If you're already kind of on the fence on seeing this movie in theaters, then maybe just wait to see it at home. I don't think this is necessarily a must-see in theaters when it comes down to the overall narrative and characters, but as a fan of the franchise, as a fan of the music, and just kind of being able to see a new installment in the series, I think there's definitely a lot that was done well when it comes down, again, to the production, to the performances, to the lighting, to the cinematography, to the composition of music throughout the course of the film, that ultimately did have me engaged and gripped. I had fun watching the film. I was engaged throughout. out. I was never necessarily bored or taken out of it, but I can ultimately look at the way that the story was kind of structured at times and recognize that there was a couple of things that felt like it was lacking, a couple of extra characters that felt like they just really shouldn't have been there, but ultimately the performances and some of the creep factor did keep me in, and I think this is a movie I'll definitely check out again at some point. But you know, this is the film I think is going to be divisive. I mentioned before there was tons of different opinions of friends of mine that I saw, and even on my car ride home, my fiance was not really a huge fan of the film. She enjoyed it, but she didn't necessarily really like it all that much. She didn't love it. And I definitely enjoyed it a lot more than her. So we had a little bit of, you know, back and forth talking about different takes and some discourse. And I could tell that there's going to be a little bit of that with this film. I don't think this is a film that's going to be a fan pleaser. I don't think this is going to just be a straight up audience pleaser. I think it's going to be really dependent on what you want out of this film. And for me, going in with minimal expectations and knowing that this was not going to in any way, shape, or form come close to the heights of the original Exorcist, I found it to be an enjoyable time. But again, I think it's going to be really dependent on your personal taste. But despite whether or not you like the story, I think that it's undeniable that there's some really great filmmaking tactics and filmmaking in general that was done in this film to bring it all to life. And I think most notably the performances are what really shine for me in this film. So that's going to be my thoughts on The Exorcist Believer. Definitely leave a comment down below letting me know what you guys thought about the film. Did you not like the movie? Did you like the movie? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.